In a 2015 captured enemy document interview, a North Vietnamese Army intelligence officer spoke words that revealed something military historians had long suspected. By 1970, we learned to track the Australian helicopter sounds, he said carefully. We knew when the SAS was being inserted. We would wait near the landing zones, ready to ambush them as they touched ground. But then they changed everything. The helicopters would come. We would prepare our positions and nothing, no patrol, just empty jungle and wasted effort. We realized too late that we had walked into their trap. This wasn't an isolated incident. It was the result of a deliberate, calculated evolution in Australian Special Air Service tactics that transformed the hunters into the hunted. Between 1966 and 1971, the SAS conducted nearly 1,200 patrols in Vietnam, maintaining the highest kill ratio of any unit in the entire war. But by 1970, that dominance faced its greatest challenge. The enemy had learned. They'd adapted. They'd begun to anticipate SAS insertion patterns and were preparing ambushes at landing zones. The North Vietnamese Army and Viet Cong, after 5 years of being systematically hunted by five-man ghost patrols, had finally found a way to strike back. What happened next became one of the most sophisticated examples of tactical deception in modern warfare. The Australian SAS didn't just adapt to this new threat, they weaponized it. They turned the enemy's hard-won intelligence into a liability, their preparation into a trap, their confidence into catastrophe. To understand how they did this, you need to understand the problem they faced, the enemy they were fighting, and the ruthless creativity that defined SAS operations in Vietnam. The Australian Special Air Service Regiment arrived in Vietnam in 1966 with a reputation forged in the jungles of Borneo during the Indonesian confrontation. They were the spiritual descendants of the British SAS, sharing the motto, "Who dares wins," and a philosophy of warfare that emphasized stealth, patience, and devastating precision. The regiment had been expanded from a company to full regiment status in 1964, consisting of 3 Sabre squadrons that would rotate through Vietnam on year-long deployments. From their base at Nui Dat in Puoc Tuy Province, SAS patrols operated throughout the surrounding areas, including Bien Hoa, Long Con, and Binh Tuy provinces. Their primary mission was long-range reconnaissance and intelligence gathering for the 1st Australian Task Force and United States forces. But as the war progressed, their role expanded to include offensive operations, ambushes, and direct action missions deep in enemy-controlled territory. The SAS patrol structure was elegantly simple and devastatingly effective. 5 men, a lead scout who navigated and detected danger first, a patrol commander who made tactical decisions, a second-in-command who could assume command if necessary, a signaller who maintained radio communications with base, and a medic who could treat wounds and injuries in the field. Each patrol member carried between 40 and 60 pounds of equipment, including ammunition, water, rations, radio gear, medical supplies, and specialized weapons ranging from M16 rifles and CAR-15 carbines to silenced Sterling submachine guns mysteriously purchased from the United Kingdom, and M79 grenade launchers that could devastate enemy positions from a distance. These 5-man teams moved through the jungle with a deliberation that seemed glacial compared to conventional infantry. Where American units might cover 5 or 6 kilometers in a day of patrolling, an SAS patrol might advance less than a kilometer. They stopped every few hundred meters to sit absolutely still for 30 minutes or more, just watching and listening to the jungle around them. Every piece of metal equipment was wrapped in tape to prevent rattling. Mud was mixed into uniforms to eliminate shine. They didn't smoke, didn't cook hot meals, and communicated only in whispers for weeks at a time. This extreme stealth was not theatrical. It was tactical necessity, born from hard lessons learned in Borneo and refined to perfection in Vietnam. The SAS understood that in the jungle, the side that moves first is usually the side that dies. The enemy controlled this terrain. They knew every trail, every water source, every hiding place. The only advantage the SAS possessed was invisibility. If they could see without being seen, observe without being detected, they could choose the time and place of engagement. They could turn the enemy's home territory into a killing ground. The results spoke for themselves with devastating clarity. Between 1966 and 1971, Australian and New Zealand SAS troops conducted nearly 1,200 patrols and eliminated over 600 enemy soldiers confirmed, with hundreds more probable kills and dozens of prisoners captured. Their own casualties were almost non-existent. 1 killed in action, 1 died of wounds, 3 accidental deaths, 1 missing, presumed dead, and 1 death from illness. 28 men were wounded across 5 years of constant operations in enemy territory. That kill ratio was unprecedented in the Vietnam War and remains one of the most extraordinary combat records in modern military history. The North Vietnamese and Viet Cong gave them a name that reflected both fear and respect: Ma Rung, the Phantoms of the Jungle. Enemy intelligence networks that successfully tracked Australian battalion movements and anticipated American operations couldn't locate or predict SAS patrols. Captured documents from 1967 and 1968 specifically warned Communist forces about SAS operations with advice that was both simple and chilling. Avoid contact if possible. Assume you are already under observation if contact is unavoidable, and assume reinforcement has been called before the first shot is fired. But the North Vietnamese Army was not a static enemy, frozen in fear. They were professionals, engaged in a war they believed they could win through patience, adaptation, and the willingness to learn from their mistakes. By 1970, after 5 years of SAS operations, patterns had emerged. The enemy had finally accumulated enough intelligence to begin predicting where and when SAS patrols would appear. The insertion technique was the vulnerability. SAS patrols were inserted by helicopter from 9 Squadron Royal Australian Air Force, flying Iroquois helicopters from their base at Kanga Pad in Nui Dat. The insertion usually occurred at dusk, when fading light made it harder for enemy observers to track the helicopters precisely. A troop carrier helicopter escorted by gunships would fly to the target area, perform a sharp descent, hover briefly while the 5-man patrol jumped out, then immediately lift off and depart the area. These insertions were conducted with as much stealth as possible, but helicopters are not quiet machines. The distinctive sound of Iroquois rotor blades carried for kilometers through the jungle. By 1970, the enemy had learned to distinguish the sound patterns of different helicopter operations. They knew what a supply run sounded like versus a medical evacuation versus a combat insertion. More critically, they had mapped the areas where SAS patrols typically operated and could predict likely landing zones based on terrain, vegetation, and proximity to suspected enemy activity. The first sign of the problem emerged in June 1970 during the second tour of 1 squadron. Patrols that had previously inserted without incident began taking fire shortly after landing. The enemy was there, waiting, with automatic weapons positioned to cover the landing zone. The SAS still had overwhelming firepower advantages and helicopter gunship support, so these ambushes rarely succeeded in killing or capturing patrol members, but they forced early extraction, compromised patrol missions, and represented a fundamental shift in the tactical equation. The hunters were being hunted at their most vulnerable moment. The Australian War Memorial records document this change with clinical precision. After 5 years of SAS patrolling, it notes, the Viet Cong had finally become familiar with SAS insertion techniques, and from June 1970 onward, it was not unusual for Australians to be fired upon by the enemy shortly after landing in an area. This was more than inconvenient. It threatened to neutralize the entire SAS operational concept. If the enemy could consistently predict insertion points and prepare ambushes, the SAS advantage evaporated. The patrols would arrive in landing zones already compromised, forcing them to fight their way out, rather than disappearing into the jungle to observe and hunt. The fear and uncertainty that made Ma Rung so effective would transfer to the Australian operators, who would never know if they were landing in a prepared ambush. The North Vietnamese had found the weakness, and they were exploiting it. The SAS response was characteristically creative and ruthless. Rather than abandoning helicopter insertions or attempting to make them quieter, which was impossible, they developed a technique that turned the enemy's intelligence into a weapon against them. They called it the cowboy insertion, and it represented a fundamental inversion of the tactical problem. Instead of trying to hide their insertions, they would make insertions obvious. Then they would use those obvious insertions to deceive the enemy and set traps of their own. The cowboy insertion worked through elegant simplicity with devastating psychological impact. 2 helicopters would fly to the target area instead of 1. The first helicopter, designated the primary, would carry the actual patrol with their real mission. The second helicopter, designated the decoy or slick, would carry a second 5-man patrol. Both helicopters would land simultaneously or in quick succession at the same landing zone. Both patrols would disembark and begin moving into the jungle as though conducting normal operations. For exactly 5 minutes, both patrols moved together away from the landing zone, following the same direction. This initial movement served multiple purposes. It prevented enemy observers from determining which patrol was real and which was decoy. It provided mutual support if the landing zone was actually compromised, and it created a single, obvious trail that enemy trackers could follow with confidence, believing they were pursuing a normal 5-man SAS patrol. After 5 minutes of synchronized movement, the patrols separated. The primary patrol with the real mission continued on their planned route, immediately reverting to the slow, methodical, utterly silent movement that defined SAS operations. The decoy patrol stopped moving entirely. They found covered positions with good visibility and settled in to wait, maintaining absolute silence and watching the jungle around them. They waited for 5 more minutes. This pause served a critical tactical purpose. If there were enemy forces tracking the patrols, this stationary period allowed them to catch up. The enemy would be moving quickly, trying to maintain contact with what they believed was a single SAS patrol. They would be making noise, breaking vegetation, focused on pursuit rather than caution. The decoy patrol, sitting absolutely still, would hear them coming. After the 5-minute waiting period, if there had been no contact with enemy forces, the decoy patrol stood up and moved back to the landing zone. The helicopter that had dropped them off would return to extract them, completing what appeared, from the enemy perspective, to be a normal mission cycle. The primary patrol, now kilometers away and operating under complete stealth, continued their actual reconnaissance or ambush mission without compromise, but if there were enemy forces tracking the patrols, the tactical situation became exponentially more dangerous for the Communist forces. The decoy patrol, stationary and alert, would detect the trackers before the trackers detected them. The SAS soldiers would be in covered positions with weapons ready, watching enemy forces move through the jungle in pursuit of a patrol that no longer existed. The hunters had become the hunted without realizing it. The engagement would be sudden, close range, and catastrophic for the North Vietnamese. The decoy patrol would open fire from concealment on enemy forces caught in the open or moving along trails. The enemy, expecting to be tracking a patrol ahead of them, would suddenly find themselves under fire from positions they'd already passed. The confusion would be absolute. Where was the patrol they'd been following? How many SAS soldiers were there? Were they surrounded? Had they walked into a prepared ambush? Meanwhile, the helicopter that had dropped off the decoy patrol was still in the area, often just minutes away. The moment contact was made, the helicopter gunships could respond with devastating speed, arriving while the enemy was still trying to comprehend what had happened. The decoy patrol would lay down suppressive fire. The gunships would strafe the enemy positions, and extraction could be completed before Communist reinforcements arrived. The psychological impact was even more devastating than the tactical result. The North Vietnamese and Viet Cong had spent years learning to predict SAS movements. They'd accumulated intelligence, identified patterns, and developed tactics to counter the phantom patrols. The cowboy insertion invalidated all of that hard-won knowledge. Every helicopter insertion became a potential trap. Every time they prepared an ambush near a suspected landing zone, they risked walking into an SAS ambush instead. Every time they heard helicopters and moved to intercept, they couldn't know if they were tracking the real patrol or running directly into a prepared kill zone. The uncertainty was paralyzing. Communist forces near known SAS operating areas faced an impossible choice. If they responded to helicopter insertions by moving to ambush landing zones, they might walk into cowboy insertion traps. If they avoided responding to insertions, they ceded operational freedom to SAS patrols that could observe their movements and call in devastating attacks. If they tried to distinguish between real and decoy patrols, they had to expose themselves by getting close enough to track the patrol movements, which put them at risk of engagement by either the primary or decoy elements. The SAS had weaponized the enemy's intelligence collection. The more the North Vietnamese tried to predict and counter SAS operations, the more vulnerable they became to the very tactics designed to exploit that predictive effort. It was tactical judo at its most sophisticated, using the enemy's strength and adaptation against them. The cowboy insertion was not the only deception technique employed by Australian SAS in Vietnam, but it exemplified the creative, ruthless approach that defined their operations. The SAS understood that superiority in jungle warfare came not from firepower or numbers, but from controlling what the enemy knew, believed, and expected. Every engagement was an intelligence operation. Every contact shaped enemy perceptions and influenced future behavior. Consider the broader context of SAS tactics and their relationship to deception. The patrols themselves were exercises in misdirection. By moving so slowly and stopping so frequently, they created gaps in time and space where the enemy couldn't predict their location. A patrol that took 9 hours to cover 1 kilometer could be almost anywhere within a large area by the end of a day. The enemy couldn't establish a search perimeter because they couldn't define where to search. The ambush techniques employed by SAS patrols relied heavily on the enemy's expectations and routine behaviors. The SAS would identify trails, water sources, or supply routes that Communist forces used regularly. Then, they would position themselves not directly on these routes, but near them, hidden in vegetation or elevated positions where they could observe without being seen. They would wait for days, if necessary, watching enemy movements, learning patterns, identifying leaders and key personnel. When they chose to engage, it was at a moment of the enemy's maximum vulnerability and minimum readiness. A supply column moving along a trail they'd used safely for months. A squad stopping to rest at a water source they'd accessed dozens of times. A command element gathering for a meeting in a location they considered secure. The attack would last 60 seconds or less. Overwhelming firepower concentrated on the most valuable targets, designed to maximize casualties and confusion. Then immediate withdrawal, melting back into the jungle before the enemy could organize a response. The enemy would find bodies but no spent brass, because the SAS policed their brass. No blood trails, because the engagement ranges were so close that wounds were immediately fatal. No footprints, because the SAS moved through vegetation rather than on ground and scattered their extract points across kilometers of jungle. Just empty forest that had momentarily turned lethal and was now silent again. This created a psychological environment where the jungle itself felt hostile. Every trail could conceal watchers. Every routine movement could be observed. Every supply run could end in sudden, devastating violence that came from nowhere and left no trace. The fear wasn't just about being killed. It was about being watched, studied, stalked by an enemy you couldn't see, couldn't predict, couldn't escape. That fear, more than the actual casualties inflicted, degraded North Vietnamese operational effectiveness in areas where the SAS operated. The cowboy insertion extended this psychological warfare to a new level. It demonstrated that the SAS could adapt faster than the enemy could learn. It showed that any advantage gained through intelligence collection could be turned into a liability. It forced the North Vietnamese to question not just what they knew about SAS tactics, but whether their knowledge itself was being manipulated against them. There were other sophisticated deception techniques employed as the war progressed. Multiple insertions in rapid succession across different landing zones, forcing the enemy to divide their response forces and guess which patrols were real missions. Insertions followed immediately by extractions in the same location, creating the impression of aborted missions, while the actual patrol moved overland from a different, unobserved entry point. False radio traffic suggesting patrol positions in areas where no patrol actually operated, drawing enemy forces away from real operations. The SAS also worked extensively with signals intelligence and captured documents to understand how the enemy collected and processed information about their operations. They learned which types of helicopter flights triggered enemy responses and which were ignored. They identified how quickly enemy intelligence networks could relay information about insertions to combat units. They mapped the gaps and delays in enemy observation systems and exploited them ruthlessly. This intelligence-driven approach to tactical deception required extraordinary discipline and patience. Techniques like the cowboy insertion only worked if they were executed with perfect operational security. If the enemy learned that some insertions were decoys, they could adapt their tactics again. The SAS maintained strict communication security, varied their techniques to prevent pattern recognition, and never discussed operational methods outside of secure channels. The partnership with 9th Squadron Royal Australian Air Force was critical to these deception operations. The helicopter crews became experts in insertion techniques, learning to vary their approach patterns, timing, and flight profiles to make enemy prediction more difficult. The pilots and door gunners understood that their role extended beyond transportation. They were active participants in a deception campaign designed to make the enemy's intelligence worthless. The New Zealand SAS troops, who served attached to Australian squadrons from late 1968 onward, contributed their own expertise to these evolving tactics. The Kiwi soldiers brought perspectives from their own training and operational experience, creating a true ANZAC special operations capability that benefited from shared knowledge and combined innovation. The final combat contact of the war for ANZAC SAS forces was made by a New Zealand patrol in February 1971, maintaining the operational tempo and effectiveness right up to the withdrawal from Vietnam. The impact of these deception tactics extended beyond immediate tactical results. The Australian SAS served as instructors at the Mika V Recondo School, teaching their techniques to American long-range reconnaissance patrol units and other special operations forces. The lessons learned about tactical deception, insertion security, and intelligence manipulation influenced special operations doctrine across multiple nations. The cowboy insertion specifically became a case study in how adaptive enemies can be countered through creative operational thinking rather than simply escalating firepower. But the real measure of success was recorded in captured enemy documents and post-war interviews with North Vietnamese veterans. The confusion and fear generated by SAS deception operations appears repeatedly in their accounts. They describe the psychological burden of operating in areas where they knew they might be under observation but couldn't detect the observers. They talk about the terror of realizing that their own intelligence efforts had been turned against them, that moving to intercept SAS patrols might mean walking into prepared ambushes. One captured NVA intelligence assessment from late 1970, after cowboy insertions had been in operation for several months, reveals the depth of the problem they faced. The document advises caution when responding to Australian helicopter insertions, noting that recent operations had resulted in heavy casualties to units attempting to intercept patrols at landing zones. It recommends maintaining distance from suspected insertion points until patrol movements can be confirmed, effectively ceding the initiative back to the SAS. The hunters had successfully become too dangerous to hunt. The sophistication of SAS deception operations also reflected a broader understanding of how guerrilla warfare actually functioned. The conventional American approach often focused on finding and destroying enemy forces through superior firepower and mobility. The Australian approach, informed by their experience in Malaya and Borneo, recognized that guerrilla forces could only be defeated by undermining their confidence in their own territory and tactics. The Viet Cong and North Vietnamese Army were highly effective because they operated with certainty in familiar terrain. They knew the trails, the villages, the jungle. They could predict where and when Allied forces would appear, allowing them to choose between engagement and withdrawal. They had intelligence networks that provided advance warning of operations. This confidence in their operational environment was their greatest strength. The SAS targeted that confidence directly. By being unpredictable in movement, devastating in engagement, and apparently omniscient in intelligence, they made the enemy's home territory feel hostile and unknowable. The deception operations amplified this effect by demonstrating that even hard-won intelligence about SAS tactics could be misleading, incomplete, or actively false. This approach required a particular type of soldier. The men selected for SAS service underwent rigorous screening and training that emphasized mental resilience, independent thinking, and adaptability as much as physical endurance or marksmanship. They needed to operate for weeks in small teams without direct supervision, make tactical decisions with strategic implications, and maintain operational security under extreme stress. The selection process was designed to identify individuals who could function effectively in this environment. The patrol course that SAS candidates completed was notoriously difficult, with high failure rates that were considered a feature rather than a problem. The Australian SAS wanted soldiers who could handle ambiguity, isolation, and constant threat without breaking down or making mistakes. The deception tactics employed in Vietnam required this level of mental toughness because the operators had to maintain perfect discipline even when acting as decoys, knowing they might draw enemy contact while the primary patrol continued its mission. The after-action reports from cowboy insertions revealed the professionalism and discipline of these decoy patrols. They would sit motionless in the jungle for the designated waiting period, resisting the temptation to move or investigate sounds that might indicate enemy presence. They understood that their job was not to seek contact, but to create a defensive position where any enemy forces tracking the patrols would expose themselves. The reports describe engagements where decoy patrols allowed enemy trackers to close within 20 or 30 meters before initiating contact, waiting for the perfect moment when the enemy was most vulnerable and most surprised. The primary patrols, meanwhile, continued their missions with the knowledge that the decoy patrol might be engaging enemy forces kilometers behind them. This created complex tactical situations where both patrols needed to maintain awareness of each other's status through radio communications while operating independently. The command and control required was sophisticated, with patrol leaders making real-time decisions about whether to proceed with primary missions or move to support decoy patrols that had made contact. The helicopter crews also faced difficult decisions. Should they extract decoy patrols immediately after contact, potentially compromising the primary patrol's mission? Should they provide fire support that might reveal the primary patrol's direction of movement? These tactical problems were resolved through extensive practice and the development of standard operating procedures that balanced operational security with the imperative to extract patrols safely when they made contact. The physical environment of Vietnam added layers of complexity to these deception operations. The jungle was not uniform. Some areas featured triple canopy rainforest so dense that visibility extended only meters. Other areas had been defoliated by Agent Orange, creating open spaces where concealment was nearly impossible. Montagnard villages, rubber plantations, rice paddies, rivers, and swamps all presented different challenges for insertion, movement, and deception. The SAS became experts in terrain analysis, learning to predict where the enemy would establish observation posts, how they would react to helicopter sounds based on the surrounding geography, and which areas could support effective decoy operations. Some terrain was too open for cowboy insertions to work because enemy observers could see both patrols separating. Other terrain was too dense for decoy patrols to establish effective overwatch positions. The technique had to be tailored to each specific operational environment. Weather also played a critical role. Monsoon rains could make helicopter operations more dangerous while providing additional concealment for patrol movements. The timing of insertions around dusk was calculated to balance the reduced visibility that helped patrols disappear into the jungle against the increased risk of helicopter accidents in fading light. The SAS developed expertise in operating under all weather conditions, refusing to limit their missions to optimal environments. The evolution of SAS tactics in Vietnam, culminating in techniques like the cowboy insertion, demonstrated a fundamental truth about special operations warfare. Technological superiority and firepower advantages matter less than tactical creativity and psychological insight. The Australian SAS never had the newest equipment or the most advanced weapons. What they had was a sophisticated understanding of how to fight an adaptive enemy through deception, patience, and ruthless exploitation of enemy assumptions. By 1971, when the last SAS squadron withdrew from Vietnam, they had completed nearly 1,200 patrols over 5 years of continuous operations. The casualty figures remained almost impossibly low. The kill ratio remained the highest of the war. But perhaps more importantly, they had demonstrated that guerrilla forces operating in their own territory could be systematically defeated by soldiers willing to out-guerrilla the guerrillas. The lessons learned in Vietnam influenced Australian Special Operations doctrine for decades. The emphasis on deception, patience, and intelligence-driven tactics became core principles of SAS training and operations. The techniques developed to counter adaptive enemies informed operations in Iraq and Afghanistan, where coalition special operations forces again faced adversaries who learned and adapted to coalition tactics. The cowboy insertion itself became a case study taught in special operations courses around the world. It exemplified the principle that when an enemy adapts to your tactics, the solution is not necessarily to develop new tactics, but to understand how they adapted and use that knowledge against them. The North Vietnamese adaptation to SAS insertions created vulnerability that could be exploited. The SAS recognized this and developed a technique specifically designed to turn enemy intelligence into a liability. The broader implication is that warfare at the tactical level is fundamentally a competition in learning and adaptation. The side that learns faster, adapts more creatively, and understands their enemy's decision-making processes more deeply will prevail regardless of material advantages. The North Vietnamese and Viet Cong were highly skilled, experienced, and motivated fighters operating in familiar terrain with extensive local support. They should have been able to neutralize small 5-man patrols operating in their territory. The fact that they couldn't, and that techniques like the cowboy insertion made their situation worse rather than better, reveals the power of tactical deception executed with discipline and creativity. The SAS didn't defeat the enemy through superior firepower or technology. They defeated them by making the enemy's own intelligence and adaptation work against them. The operational reality of these deception tactics becomes clearer when examining specific examples from patrol reports and after-action assessments. In August 1970, during Operation Kong Chung Do Chawand, a cowboy insertion was conducted in an area of Long Con Province where enemy activity had increased significantly. Intelligence suggested that North Vietnamese forces were monitoring helicopter traffic and positioning quick reaction forces near likely landing zones. The primary patrol's mission was to observe a suspected supply route and gather intelligence on enemy troop movements. The insertion occurred at dusk, with both helicopters landing within seconds of each other. The primary and decoy patrols moved together for the designated 5 minutes, creating a clear trail through the vegetation. Then they separated. The primary patrol continued north toward their observation position. The decoy patrol took covered positions in dense undergrowth with good sight lines back along their movement path. 17 minutes after the separation, the decoy patrol detected movement. 3 North Vietnamese soldiers were following their trail, moving quickly and quietly, weapons ready. They were clearly tracking the patrol, expecting to locate and ambush the SAS soldiers ahead of them. The decoy patrol leader allowed them to close to 15 meters before initiating contact with a burst of automatic fire. All 3 enemy soldiers were killed instantly. The patrol called in their contact report, moved to an alternate extraction point, and were picked up by helicopter within 12 minutes. The primary patrol, completely uncompromised, continued their mission and spent the next 4 days observing the supply route, gathering intelligence that led to a larger operation. This was not an isolated success. Between June 1970 and the end of SAS operations in Vietnam in early 1971, cowboy insertions were credited with multiple successful engagements where decoy patrols eliminated enemy forces attempting to intercept or track SAS operations. More importantly, the technique dramatically reduced the number of compromised insertions. After the cowboy insertion became standard procedure, reports of patrols taking fire immediately after landing decreased significantly, even though enemy forces were still active in the same areas. The enemy's response to cowboy insertions revealed the depth of the tactical problem they faced. Some North Vietnamese units simply stopped responding to helicopter insertions entirely, allowing SAS patrols to insert without interference. This gave the SAS complete operational freedom, but left those communist forces vulnerable to observation and ambush. Other units became extremely cautious, waiting hours or even days before attempting to track patrols from landing zones, which reduced their effectiveness in intercepting SAS operations. Still others attempted to establish long-range observation posts that could monitor landing zones without closing to tracking distance. But these observation posts were themselves vulnerable to SAS patrols that deliberately sought them out. The psychological toll on North Vietnamese forces operating in SAS areas of operation cannot be overstated. Multiple post-war interviews with NVA veterans describe the constant stress of knowing that Australian patrols might be observing their positions but being unable to detect or locate them. The addition of deception tactics like cowboy insertions intensified this stress by making any attempt to actively counter SAS operations potentially fatal. One former North Vietnamese company commander, interviewed by Australian military historians in the late 1990s, described the dilemma in stark terms. His unit had lost nearly 30% of its strength to SAS ambushes and attacks over a 6-month period in 1969 and 1970. When his superiors ordered him to prioritize locating and eliminating SAS patrols, he attempted to establish tracking teams near known insertion areas. 3 separate attempts resulted in his tracking teams being ambushed and decimated. After the 3rd incident, he refused further orders to pursue SAS patrols directly, accepting a formal reprimand rather than sacrifice more soldiers in what he considered futile efforts. This was exactly the outcome the SAS sought. By making direct confrontation catastrophically expensive for the enemy, they forced North Vietnamese and Viet Cong units to cede operational space and initiative. The goal wasn't necessarily to kill every enemy soldier, though they excelled at that. The goal was to make the enemy unable to operate effectively in areas where the SAS was present. The deception tactics amplified this effect by showing that even careful, intelligence-based attempts to counter SAS operations could backfire. The broader tactical environment in which these deception operations occurred also deserves examination. The first Australian task force operated with a significantly different philosophy than American forces in Vietnam. While American units often focused on search and destroy missions using aggressive patrolling and massive firepower, the Australians emphasized persistent, methodical operations designed to control territory through superior fieldcraft and intelligence rather than firepower superiority. This philosophical difference extended to how forces were employed. American battalions might conduct sweeps through areas, staying for days or weeks before moving to another operational area. Australian battalions established bases and then systematically patrolled their area of operations, building intelligence over time about enemy movements, bases, and supply routes. The SAS fit perfectly into this approach, providing the long-range reconnaissance capability that identified targets for battalion-level operations. The relationship between SAS intelligence gathering and larger Australian operations created a force multiplication effect. An SAS patrol might spend a week observing an enemy base area, identifying the number of soldiers, their defensive positions, their supply routes, and their patrol patterns. This intelligence would then inform a battalion-level operation specifically designed to attack that base at its moment of maximum vulnerability. The planning would account for likely enemy escape routes, positioning blocking forces to catch enemy soldiers trying to withdraw. The result was operations that achieved high enemy casualty ratios with relatively low Australian losses. The deception operations conducted by the SAS fed into this larger operational concept. When enemy forces wasted resources trying to intercept SAS insertions, or spent combat power hunting for patrols that were actually decoys, they degraded their own operational effectiveness. This made them more vulnerable to the subsequent battalion operations informed by actual SAS intelligence gathering. The tactical deception at the patrol level contributed to operational success at the task force level. The contrast with how Viet Cong and North Vietnamese forces had adapted to American operations is instructive. Against American units, the enemy learned to engage briefly, inflict casualties, then break contact before American firepower assets could respond. They would ambush convoys or patrols, fight for 5 or 10 minutes, then disperse into the jungle before artillery or air support arrived. This tactic, called hugging, when conducted at extremely close range to prevent airstrikes, was reasonably effective at managing American firepower advantages. But this tactic didn't work against Australian operations and was completely ineffective against the SAS. Australian forces, and especially SAS patrols, didn't rely on massive firepower to win engagements. They relied on superior positioning, surprise, and precise fire discipline. An SAS ambush might last 60 seconds because the enemy forces were caught in a perfectly prepared kill zone where escape was impossible. The engagement ended not because the SAS broke contact, but because all the enemy soldiers in the kill zone were dead or incapacitated. This created a learning problem for the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong. The tactics they'd developed against American forces didn't translate to fighting Australians. When they tried to adapt specifically to Australian tactics, they faced the problem of deception operations that invalidated their adaptations. The result was a persistent tactical disadvantage that couldn't be overcome through standard military learning processes. The role of patience in SAS operations and deception tactics cannot be emphasized enough. Modern military operations often prioritize speed and tempo, trying to move faster than the enemy can respond. The SAS took the opposite approach in Vietnam. They moved slowly, thought carefully, and acted decisively only when they had overwhelming tactical advantages. This patience extended to their deception operations. Consider the cowboy insertion technique. The decoy patrol had to sit absolutely still for 5 minutes, sometimes longer, waiting to see if enemy forces would reveal themselves. 5 minutes might not sound like a long time, but in a jungle where you've just landed in a helicopter that the enemy could have heard from kilometers away, 5 minutes of complete immobility requires extraordinary discipline. The patrol members couldn't move to investigate sounds. They couldn't adjust their positions for comfort. They couldn't communicate except through hand signals. They had to trust that if the enemy was there, patience would reveal them. This kind of patience was drilled into SAS soldiers through their training. The patrol course included exercises where candidates had to remain motionless in uncomfortable positions for extended periods, while instructors tried to detect the slightest movement. The message was clear. In the jungle, the side that moves first usually loses. Patience wasn't just a virtue. It was a tactical weapon that could be deployed as effectively as any rifle or grenade. The broader evolution of SAS tactics in Vietnam also demonstrates how special operations forces can serve as laboratories for tactical innovation. Because SAS patrols operated independently with significant freedom of action, patrol commanders could experiment with techniques and report results back to squadron headquarters. Successful innovations would be shared across patrols and refined through collective experience. Unsuccessful techniques would be abandoned quickly. This decentralized innovation process allowed the SAS to adapt much faster than conventional forces. A conventional battalion might take months to modify tactics because changes had to flow through command structures and be approved at multiple levels. An SAS patrol could try a new technique on one mission, evaluate the results immediately, and either adopt it or discard it based on direct tactical feedback. The cowboy insertion emerged from this process of continuous experimentation and refinement. The specific origin of the cowboy insertion is worth examining. The technique appears to have been developed in response to the specific problem of compromised insertions in mid-1970, but the concept built on earlier SAS practices. Multiple insertions in rapid succession had been used occasionally to confuse enemy tracking efforts. False insertions, where helicopters would land without actually deploying patrols, had been conducted to desensitize enemy forces to helicopter activity. The cowboy insertion combined these concepts with the added element of the decoy patrol, actively creating a trap for enemy trackers. The name cowboy insertion itself reflects Australian military culture and humor. It suggested something bold, slightly reckless, and distinctly non-standard. The official term in operation orders might have been something more formal, like dual patrol insertion with contingent extraction, but soldiers called it the cowboy insertion, and the name stuck. This informal naming reflected the SAS culture that valued effectiveness and results over rigid adherence to doctrinal terminology. The execution of cowboy insertions required exceptional coordination between multiple elements. The helicopter crews from 9 Squadron had to position both aircraft precisely, time their insertions perfectly, and maintain readiness to extract the decoy patrol on short notice. The patrol commanders had to communicate their movements and status through radio without compromising operational security. The squadron headquarters had to track multiple patrols simultaneously and coordinate extraction assets. The level of coordination required was significant, but the SAS and their supporting aviation units had developed this coordination through years of operations. The close relationship between the SAS and 9 Squadron Royal Australian Air Force deserves particular attention. The helicopter crews were not simply transportation providers. They were integral members of the operational team who understood SAS tactics and contributed their own expertise to mission planning and execution. The pilots learned to perform insertions that minimized exposure time and maximized the patrol's ability to disappear into the jungle quickly. The door gunners provided covering fire during insertions and extractions and could identify terrain features that might affect patrol movements. This relationship was built through shared experience and mutual respect. The SAS soldiers knew that the helicopter crews would risk their lives to extract patrols under fire. The helicopter crews knew that SAS patrols would fight their way to extraction points rather than expecting pilots to land in hot landing zones under direct fire. This mutual trust enabled complex operations like cowboy insertions where split-second timing and perfect execution were necessary for success. The New Zealand SAS contribution to Australian operations added another dimension to the tactical picture. The Kiwi soldiers brought their own training background and operational experience, creating productive cross-pollination of techniques and ideas. New Zealand and Australian SAS soldiers served together in integrated patrols, sharing knowledge and learning from each other. The ANZAC Special Operations Partnership that emerged from this integration became a model for coalition special operations that persists today. The specific operational areas where SAS patrols conducted their missions presented diverse challenges that required tactical flexibility. Phuoc Tuai Province, where the Australian Task Force was based, included everything from coastal lowlands to mountainous jungle. The Maytau Mountains in the northeast of the province were known enemy strongholds, heavily forested and difficult to access. The long high hills in the southeast offered different terrain with rocky outcroppings and less dense vegetation. Rubber plantations provided open areas with straight rows of trees that created unique visibility and movement patterns. Each terrain type required modifications to standard tactics. In triple canopy jungle, patrols could move relatively close to enemy positions without being detected because visibility was measured in meters. In more open areas like rubber plantations, observation distances increased to hundreds of meters, requiring different movement techniques and greater caution. The deception tactics also had to be adapted to terrain. Cowboy insertions worked best in areas with sufficient vegetation to conceal the decoy patrol, but enough open space for them to observe approaching enemy forces. The intelligence picture that guided SAS operations was built from multiple sources. Signals intelligence from radio intercepts provided information about enemy unit locations and movements. Human intelligence from village informants and captured prisoners gave details about local enemy organization and plans. Aerial reconnaissance identified trails, base areas, and other signs of enemy activity. The SAS patrols themselves were a critical intelligence collection asset, providing ground truth that confirmed or refuted other intelligence sources. This comprehensive intelligence approach meant that SAS missions were carefully planned based on the best available information about enemy activity. When enemy forces began intercepting SAS insertions in 1970, the intelligence picture helped explain why. Analysis of insertion patterns revealed that the SAS had inadvertently created predictable patterns in insertion timing, locations, and flight paths. The enemy had simply observed these patterns over time and learned to predict where and when insertions would occur. The cowboy insertion was designed specifically to break these patterns while providing a mechanism to catch enemy forces that had positioned themselves based on predicted insertion locations. It was an intelligence-driven solution to an intelligence-based problem. The enemy's successful intelligence collection against SAS operations became the foundation for a deception operation that turned their intelligence advantage into a tactical liability. The long-term impact of SAS operations and tactical innovations in Vietnam extended far beyond the immediate battlefield results. The techniques developed and refined in Vietnam influenced Australian Special Operations doctrine for decades. The emphasis on patience, stealth, and deception became core elements of SAS training and operational planning. The lessons about adaptive enemies and the importance of continuous tactical innovation shaped how Australian Special Forces approached later conflicts. When Australian Special Forces deployed to Afghanistan and Iraq in the early 21st century, they brought with them the institutional memory and doctrinal framework developed in Vietnam. The emphasis on understanding enemy learning processes and using deception to invalidate that learning proved relevant in conflicts against insurgent forces that were themselves highly adaptive. The specific techniques might have changed, but the underlying principles remained constant. The broader lesson from SAS deception operations in Vietnam applies to any military force facing an adaptive enemy. Tactical superiority is not permanent. Enemy forces learn, adapt, and develop countermeasures. The side that prevails is not necessarily the one with the best initial tactics, but the one that can innovate faster and more creatively than their opponent can adapt. The SAS demonstrated this principle repeatedly in Vietnam, and the cowboy insertion stands as perhaps the clearest example of turning enemy adaptation into enemy vulnerability. The psychological dimensions of these operations deserve final consideration. War at the tactical level is as much about psychology as about physical destruction. The goal of combat operations is not simply to kill enemy soldiers, but to destroy the enemy's will and ability to continue fighting. The SAS achieved this through a combination of devastating tactical results and psychological operations that made the enemy feel observed, vulnerable, and unable to effectively counter Australian operations. The deception tactics amplified the psychological impact by creating persistent uncertainty. When every helicopter insertion might be a trap, when every attempt to track SAS patrols might result in ambush, when the enemy's own intelligence capabilities could be turned against them, the psychological burden became overwhelming. North Vietnamese and Viet Cong soldiers operating in SAS areas of operations lived under constant stress, never knowing if they were being watched, never certain if their movements were being observed and reported, never confident that their tactical decisions weren't being predicted and exploited. This psychological impact persisted long after individual engagements ended. A soldier who survives an ambush carries that experience with them, making them more cautious, more fearful, less aggressive in future operations. A unit that loses tracking teams to decoy patrol ambushes learns to avoid trying to track patrols, even when doing so might provide tactical advantages. The cumulative psychological effect of SAS operations was to create an enemy that was operationally timid in areas where the SAS operated, ceding initiative and freedom of action to Australian forces. That female Viet Cong fighter in the 2015 documentary interview was right to fear the Australian SAS, but her fear went beyond their tactical skills or their stealth in the jungle. The deepest fear came from knowing that her side's best efforts to understand and counter the SAS only made them more dangerous. Every pattern identified became a trap. Every tactic learned became obsolete. Every move to adapt was anticipated and exploited. The Australian SAS had turned the very process of learning and adaptation into a weapon, and that made them truly unstoppable in the jungles of Vietnam. The legacy of these operations continues to influence special operations thinking worldwide. The principle that deception can be more powerful than firepower, that patience can defeat aggression, and that understanding enemy decision-making processes is as important as understanding enemy capabilities. These principles were proven in the jungles of Vietnam by five-man patrols that moved like ghosts and fought like demons. The cowboy insertion stands as a testament to the power of tactical creativity and the importance of turning enemy strengths into vulnerabilities through careful analysis and bold execution.